thank you all for joining today and listening to my talk. Like Ariane said, I am currently a PhD student in Barcelona in Spain, and I'm working on properties emerging at interfaces and effects in low-dimensional nanostructures, and particularly focusing on quantum electron transport. Today, I would like to talk to you about interference in one-dimensional Moiré crystals, and we'll look at some double-wall carbon nanotubes as specific cases of these Moiré crystals. Now, most of the time when we think about Moirés, we think about two-dimensional Moiré patterns. And this is actually quite a fascinating field of research, I think, because if we look at a layered structure and we create such a Moiré by twisting one of them or having two different lattice constants in the two materials, then we can see that this Moiré modulation of the structure actually brings about completely new properties of the two materials that they would not exhibit if they were isolated. And all of this is often done just by weak interactions, van der Waals interactions. The prime example in 2 dimensions is, I guess, twisted bilayer graphene, which is a tunable quantum material. So there are quantum effects visible at the meso or even at the macro scale if we find the right twisting angle. And yeah, examples of effects that are emerging in this kind of structure, bilayer graphene, is strong interlayer coupling. We can see superconductivity, and there are Moiré excitons which emerge depending on which exact Moiré crystal we're looking at. Lesser known are the Moiré crystals in 1 dimension, which also exist. And we can find these in layered 1-dimensional systems. And I think a beautiful example of that are double-wall carbon nanotubes, which are in a lot of ways similar to twisted bilayer graphene. They also consist of graphene sheets. They're layered and they're Moiré crystals. In 2 dimensions, we only have the angle in which we can twist the 2 layers with respect to each other and then tune the properties. If we look at a 1D Moiré crystal instead, we have multiple parameters that we can play with in order to tune this interaction between the 2 layers. We have the angle between the chiral vectors, we have the direction of the chiral vectors, and we have the difference between the radii. So we have multiple things that we can play with in order to tune the interaction to get exactly what we want to affect the electronic states and the quantum transport. Single-wall carbon nanotubes are a little bit more easy to describe than double-wall carbon nanotubes, and they are basically completely defined by their chiral vector, or the 2 chiral indices which correspond to the chiral vector. And relatively early on, after the discovery of carbon nanotubes, people already predicted that if the difference between their chiral indices is a multiple of 3, they're going to be metallic, and otherwise they're going to be semiconducting. This follows directly from the band structure of graphene. If we realize that the wave vectors in the direction of the chiral vector are going to be quantized because we merge a graphene sheet along one direction, so we are enforcing periodic boundary conditions, and therefore the wave vector in that direction has to be quantized. And now if the K point falls into the allowed K vectors, then we have a metallic tube, otherwise we end up with a semiconducting tube. This is demonstrated on the right-hand side here for 2 nanotubes, a 5-5 armchair nanotube and a 10-0 zigzag nanotube. In the 5-5 nanotube, the difference is 0, so the tube's metallic. In the 10-0 case, the difference is 10, not a multiple of 3, and the tube is semiconducting. These carbon nanotubes are known to conduct electrons ballistically, and their transmission function is clearly quantized. And the smallest unit of quantization in these carbon nanotubes is 2 times the conductance quantum, G0. We can see that here in the transmission plots that have just popped up. In the armchair tube, for example, if we see, laser pointer, if we see up here, then we see that there are 2 bands and the corresponding transmission is 2. If we see down here where we have a degenerate band 2 times, then we count 6 bands and the transmission is 6. And similarly, if we go to the 10-0 nanotube, there's no transmission the band gap, and then there's no transmission in the band gap because there are no bands. So for all single bond carbon nanotubes, actually this transmission is quantized in steps of 2g0. However, 25 years ago, there was a group of researchers that measured transport in carbon nanotubes, and they found that there was a quantization of 1g0 in some cases. So the smallest unit that they found was 1g0, not 2g0. How is that possible? If we have just seen that single wall carbon nanotubes have 2g0 as the minimal conductance, and then maybe we go to a multi-layer carbon nanotube, a double wall carbon nanotube, or even more, like the head in this case, then the transmission function should still be quantized in multiples of 2g0. It can be more than for a single wall carbon nanotube, but we should expect it to still be quantized in terms of 2g0. But at the core of this idea stands the assumption that the double wall carbon nanotubes are basically just superpositions of the single wall carbon nanotubes, completely neglecting the interaction between the layers and the Moiré nature of these crystals. And actually, I will show later on that we can construct a scenario where the conductance is quantized, or the smallest conductance quantum is 1g0 in these transmission curves and not 2g0 like it is conventionally. Now, before we get into our work, I would like to point out this beautiful work by Koshino that was published in 2015, which beautifully demonstrates that this interaction between the layers is actually very essential in understanding double wall carbon nanotubes, and the Moiré plays an important role here. What Koshino and his co-workers did is they used a continuum model to model idealized infinite double wall carbon nanotubes, and they identify 3 different regimes of carbon nanotubes, which are vastly different in their properties. And the first one is the strong coupling regime. Then there's a weak coupling regime and a regime that they call the localized insulating regime. And these 3 regimes emerged dependent on how the chiral vectors of the 2 nanotubes line up. I will briefly say the weak coupling regime actually is the regime where the assumption that we can just use the superposition of individual tubes to describe the electronic structure. This assumption holds up in those weak coupling tubes, but in strong coupling tubes, that's absolutely not the case anymore. You see that here in the 2 top plots. On the one side, you see the band structure of the 2 nanotubes without any interaction. And then on the right side, you see what happens when you switch on the interaction. So we start from 2 semiconducting nanotubes, and we actually end up with a metallic nanotube, which I think is quite fascinating if you think that there's just van der Waals interaction involved here. And then the third regime is the localized insulating regime, in which flat bands emerge. So the band structure kind of gets fractured, and these flat bands, if you see on the right side in the bottom panel, emerge, and they indicate that there's some localization. So are we done with double wall carbon nanotubes? Do we know everything that we should know? Well, they still don't really know where the 1g0 conductance could come from. And we also don't know if these regimes, which they predict for idealized infinite tubes, actually hold up when we go to finite segments, which we'll find in every experiment. And in which limit of finite segments can we actually see these physics that emerge due to the Moiré nature. And this is exactly what we set out to study. In our work, we mostly use a tight binding model that we based on DFT calculations of various carbon nanotubes. And we use this tight binding model then to simulate the quantum transport with the Landauer-Büttiker approach, which we again verified against the DFT plus the Landauer-Büttiker methods in order to make sure that we're doing everything properly. For our work, we use a special transport setup, which is different from transport setups that you would usually see involving carbon nanotubes. We're not looking at one carbon nanotube that's extended in both directions, or one carbon nanotube that changes from one radius to a different one. We have on the one side one carbon nanotube, on the other side another carbon nanotube, and then in the scattering region we overlap those two carbon nanotubes, creating a finite segment of a double wall carbon nanotube. This setup allows us to do a couple of things that are usually a little bit difficult to do. We can simulate any combination of carbon nanotubes without having to worry about large supercells or forced periodicity if we use traditional periodic approaches to simulating these nanotubes. And we can directly probe the interlayer interaction, because if we calculate the transmission from one tube into the other, that is only possible via the interlayer interaction. So this is the first case that I would like to show you, which is a strong coupling carbon nanotube consisting of two armchair nanotubes. Both of them are metallic. And here we already see what I hinted at. The conductance is actually limited to 1G0. If you look at the highlighted plot, there's a plateau here, which is at 1G0 and not at 2G0. That's already pretty nice. And how can we understand where this is coming from? Well, if we look at the band structure of this particular double wall carbon nanotube, we see that there are 4 bands. So had we just used the ideal infinite double wall carbon nanotube, we would get 4G0 as the conductance. But now we use this asymmetric transport setup. So that means that we reduce the transmission, because each of the electrodes only has 2 available channels. So the maximum transmission of this combined system is also 2G0. But then there's another reduction to 1G0. Where does that come from? Well, we can understand that by looking at the projection of the electronic bands in the double wall carbon nanotube onto the different layers. And you can see here that the 2 bands with positive Fermi velocity are localized either on the outer or on the inner tube, whereas the 2 bands with negative Fermi velocity are perfectly hybridized between the 2 tubes. Well, the localized states, they can't really contribute to the interlayer transport because they're localized on one side of the tube, and only the hybridized states contribute. And this is the one channel, the channel with the negative Fermi velocity, which then leads to the 1G0 conductance through the system. There's a secondary feature in the transmission, which you can see here. There are some dips, kind of evenly spaced almost. And we looked at where they could be coming from. And actually, if you calculate the eigenstates of this transport setup, just a little bit extended so that we can calculate the eigenfunctions, then we see that we can see that there are eigenstates which coincide with the energies of these dips, and they have one thing in common, these eigenstates. They're localized on the overlap region. So they're not localized on either of the 2 tubes. They're not completely delocalized through the whole system, but they're really localized in the overlap region. And I can show you this in some DFT wave functions that we calculated for the system. Here at the top, you see one of those states which is just localized on one tube, in this case, the inner tube. Then in the middle, you have this kind of localized state that I was referring to before, where you see here that the wave function really is delocalized between the 2 layers, but localized only in the overlap region. And then you have the last case where the state is completely delocalized between the 2 tubes. And these are the states that then contribute to the transmission. What happens if we vary the overlap? Because so far we've looked at this transport setup with a fixed overlap and then looked at different energies. Well, we calculated the transmission function over and over again for different overlaps. And this trend that you can see here on the right-hand side emerges, where you have regions of large transmission, roughly 1G0, and then you have regions where the transmission is almost completely or completely blocked. And this is actually quite a large change in the overlap that is needed to tune from one of these regimes into the other. It's about 50 angstrom to go from no transmission to full transmission, and then another 50 to go back to no transmission. So there's an oscillation with a period of 100 angstrom. So we are already looking at effects that happen in the mesoscale and no longer at the nanoscale. How can we understand where this modulation is coming from? Well, for that, I would like to simplify the model further and just look at interference of one-dimensional waves and abstracting from the carbon nanotube. And if you think about an incoming wave from one side with a negative Fermi velocity, because we want to look at the transmitting parts, then this wave function will have a specific wave vector for every energy, because we have basically linear bands, just like in graphene. Well, as this wave then enters the overlap region, it's going to split into two wave components. And we can see that here in the band structure again, we see that the two white bands are split in energy, or split in momentum. The Fermi wave vector is slightly different, whereas for the other tubes, it's almost this, whereas for the other direction, it's basically the same. So this change in the wave vector here will give rise to a modulation in the overlap region. There's one modulation which goes with the difference in the Fermi wave vector, and then there's one modulation which continues as before with this initial wave vector. And depending on how the amplitude of the wave function on either of the two tubes is at the end of the overlap region, we will either see that there's perfect transmission. That's the case if a full number of wave functions fits in the overlap region plus half, or we will have no transmission if the modulation is just commensurate with the overlap length. And then in between, we will have partial transmission, where part of the electrons is going to go through and the other part is going to be reflected. Not only this long modulation can be commensurate with the overlap length, but also the faster oscillation based on the initial wave vector can be. And this will then give rise to the localized states that form in the overlap region and block the transmission at specific energies. Now, we put this model also to the test to see if this does not give us a correct result. So we extracted the change in the Fermi wave vector, which is about 0.071 per angstrom, and that corresponds to a period of about 89 angstrom. So actually that's pretty close to what we see in the transmission curve, given how simple this model is to describe the transmission. Okay. Does this hold true for other carbon nanotubes as well? Well, we tried it with another carbon nanotube. In this case, we again chose a metallic carbon nanotube because we want transmission through the system. So we need both electrodes to be metallic. But in this case, the tubes are incommensurate and they are achiral. So this is quite a drastic change from they're both chiral. This is a change from the achiral nature of the armchair nanotubes and the incommensurate, which is also very different. And again, here we see that there are regions of perfect transmission and there are regions of basically no transmission as we change the overlap length from short to longer. And again, we looked at the band structure. We extracted the change in the Fermi wave vector and compared it to the period that we observe in the transmission plots. And again, it matches quite well. So we think that this model of just looking at the 1D waves is quite accurate in making predictions about how the transmission through these strong coupling nanotubes works if both of them are metallic, of course. In this case, we do not see this reduction of the conductance down to 1G0 as we had seen in the previous case. And the reason for this is that in this particular nanotube, both of the band or all of the bands hybridize. There's no localization on one of the tubes or the other tube. So both of the channels in the low energy range can actually contribute to the electron transport, and they do. Another difference with respect to what we've previously seen is that we see no dips here emerging at specific energies. And we propose that this is because this nanotube has no rotational symmetries, which means that if there was a wave function, a localized wave function emerging in the overlap region, it is difficult to have a node everywhere at the edge of the nanotube because it's not going to be a clean edge perpendicular to the tube axis, but it's going to be skewed. And therefore, there's not this decoupling of a wave function completely from both electrodes. We have 2G0 is. We don't have these dips in the transmission. Now, on to the next regime, the localized insulating regime. Sorry, is there a question? Or okay. Onto the localized insulating regime. Here we expect flat bands to emerge, and these flat bands are supposed to emerge due to a long range modulation in the interlayer potential, at which then electrons are partially localized. So we simulated, similar to before, for different overlap lengths, this system. And actually we see, quite surprisingly, that even at short overlap lengths, we already see sharp spikes in the density of states, which indicate the emergence of flat bands. Now, according to Cuscino and his co-workers, the modulation that's responsible for the localization of the electrons is about 1,200 angstrom. And here we see that some of these flat bands already emerge if we look at 81 angstrom overlap lengths or 244. So that is actually, I think, surprising that we can see these states already in much shorter segments. But this also means that these effects are experimentally accessible because we see them in short segments and don't need to go to very large length. However, we have to note that as we increase the overlap length, since we haven't reached this 1,200 angstrom or even multiples of 1,200 angstrom, we only see part of the localized states. And as we go to larger overlap lengths, the number of states and their significance increases. In this particular nanotube that I showed here, which the interlayer distance is very small. It's just 3.1 angstrom, so much smaller, for example, than the graphite spacing, which of course enhances the coupling. And you might ask, well, in this particular case, it might happen. Does it also happen if the interlayer spacing is larger? And we can say, yes, it does. We check the same thing with a different nanotube with larger interlayer spacing, and still we see sharp spikes emerging given that slightly larger overlap lengths. And again, their density increases as we increase the overlap length and also their significance. Sorry. In this case, we have two metallic layers, whereas before the one that I had shown you had a semiconducting and a metallic layer. So here we can also interpret the conductance between the two nanotubes. And we can actually see that the conductance is completely suppressed. The scale that is here on the conductance plot is much lower than in the metallic case. And even though both tubes are metallic, there's basically no interlayer transmission. And this is characteristic for the localized insulating regime and also the weak coupling regime, where the assumption of just superposition of the two structures, the two electronic structures, is applicable. So we can also say from this that the transmission between two layers is actually only significant if the strong coupling regime is at hand. Yeah, now we're already approaching the end of the talk, and I would like to thank Pablo Orejon, Mathieu Verstret, and Zela Zanoli for their continued support throughout this project and their guidance. I would like to thank Luc Henrat and Philippe Lambert from the University of Namur, with which we had very enriching discussions about the tight binding parametrization as we started this project. And I would like to thank all the funding agencies and organizations that have made this project possible. I would like you to take a few things home from this talk, and that is that coupling regimes in double wall carbon nanotubes already are present in finite double wall carbon nanotube segments. So they're easily accessible in experiments. And wave function interference plays a very crucial role in explaining their properties and is visible at the mesoscale. In the strong coupling regime, interlayer transport can be significant, is sometimes blocked by localized states, and is periodically modulated by the overlap length. In the localized insulating regime, interlayer transport is basically completely suppressed, and flat bands emerge depending on the overlap length, and they increase in number and density as the overlap length becomes larger. I would also like you to remember that there's a small model that you can use to predict the transport properties of strong coupling nanotubes. And one way in which we could use this modulation that we've seen before is we could think of a small switch, of a quantum switch that we construct of two carbon nanotubes by moving them in and out of each other using, for example, a piezo element. And that way we could build switches for nanoelectronics. If you would like to read more about this work, you can of course ask questions right now after the talk, or you can go to the Carbon Journal and read our paper there. Thank you for your attention, and that's it from me. If you have any questions, please feel free to ask.
Thank you very much, Niels, for this nice presentation. Are there questions? If there are, you can raise your hand or just unmute yourself. There's a question from Lucia. Please go ahead. And then Rex, I see as well.
Okay, thank you. That was super interesting. I was just a little confused about what you mean by coupling, because at some stage you talk about interaction and then about van der Waals interaction.
Yeah.
Are we talking about a Coulomb interaction here or about hybridization between the tubes when we, what is important here?
Okay. Yeah, I think there is actually, we should actually think about it as hybridization of states between the two carbon nanotubes, which plays the crucial role here in driving the effects that emerge in the layered structure. Yeah.
Okay, so it's actually quite different from the van der Waals interaction that would give us the equilibrium structure and so on.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, so you think that one could make a sort of non-interacting calculation and would still get the essential effects? Well,
no, the interaction is what leads to the hybridization, right? Because if we don't have an interaction between the electrons in the two tubes, then there's not going to be any hybridization of states between them. So I don't think that we can.
Well, I mean, if you just have two potentials and their states, and you bring them together, they would hybridize. Of course, we wouldn't get the correct numerical results because the effective potentials would be wrong. But in this sense, I agree. But I don't think we need Coulomb interaction to hybridize. So I was just curious of how important interaction is here.
Okay,
because I see this Moiré things. It's all very interesting, but I'm not familiar, so I have no feeling.
So to be honest, I mean, if we just had the structure and there was no interaction between I guess maybe we have to think about what does it mean that there's no interaction. But if there's no, so for me, thinking about no interaction would mean that there's no term in the Hamiltonian which couples the states of one tube to the states of the other tube, right?
Well,
and if we do that, then there's not going to be any of these effects, right? Because then we just basically enforce that there's no coupling.
I wouldn't completely agree, but we can discuss further. But I would say if you have two systems with two different potentials, you bring them together. Even without Coulomb interaction, the Hamiltonian is no longer diagonal in the basis of one or the other.
Okay.
Okay. But certainly quantitatively, I would fully agree. I mean, interaction plays a role, but it's very nice. Thank you.
Thank you. So there was a question from Rex.
Yeah, you told us fairly early in the talk that in experiments, the conductance of 1 G0 was observed, which indeed your calculations reproduced in certain geometries.
Yes.
Are you able to make any closer contact with experiment? In particular, in the experiments, are they able to control the geometries and the overlap length of the nanotubes?
And so, to my understanding, that is exactly one of the, I don't want to say problems, but a challenge in the experiment, to actually know the exact chirality of both tubes, and even if you know it, to control it in the creation process in a way that you can say, I want this tube inside, I want this tube outside. I think it's still not very possible. The characterization, I think there are options of characterizing the tubes, but the targeted creation is much more difficult. Yeah. If not impossible. Yeah.
Could I just ask a supplementary question? You told us that you were using Siesta with DFT
Yes.
and so on. Obviously, the elementary discussions of properties of carbon nanotubes that we have all seen over the years are often just based on simple type binding picture. Which of the details of the results that you showed us sort of depend crucially on a proper DFT description of the electronic states, rather than just some very simple type binding picture?
So I think for the individual tube, a simple type binding model is a reasonable approach. Just like in graphene, like a first nearest neighbor type binding model already gives very reasonable results. But I think, especially when we look at the interlayer interaction, that's where it's important to have a very accurate description, because there are type binding models that use a first or second nearest neighbor approximation in the interlayer interaction. And then, for example, they see strong dependence on the rotational alignment of the carbon nanotubes. Whereas when we simulate that in DFT, we don't see that. And I think that's because the interlayer interaction is discretized in such a way that if you rotate, you have more or less neighbors, depending on what the exact position is. And we don't see this in DFT. And we actually had to go to very large orbital sets in order to get this behavior, which we had seen in plane waves. So I think that way there's quite important things that we can learn from the DFT when it comes to the interaction between the layers, more so as the interaction within the layer.
What you said last sounds a bit surprising, in the sense that one would expect that the main features of what you're calculating are related to symmetry properties, which wouldn't be strongly affected by the particular shape of the Wittemeier functions that happen to span a particular band. Do you have any further comment on that?
Yeah, so in a lot of carbon nanotubes, there's actually not that much rotational symmetry. It's mostly the chiral nanotubes where we really have to think about the rotational symmetries, because if the chirality of the two tubes is different, then we basically have no more rotational symmetries at all. And so that way, that's very expected. And then in the achiral nanotubes, it is a little bit surprising that there's little dependence on the rotational properties, and I don't have a very good explanation why that would be the case, but we actually looked into this multiple times, and we could not reproduce either with DFT nor with the type binding model the predictions of rotational dependence on the band structure or the transmission properties.
Could it be that when you're looking at Moiré states, then it's necessary to consider the, as it were, the Wittemeier functions on the scale of the Moiré pattern, which is completely different from the scale of a single orbital?
Yeah.
As a follow-up to Rex's questions and comments, could you say a bit more about indeed the flow chart of the calculations that you do? So you start from a DFT calculation, and I had understood that from that you obtain somehow the parameters that you go into the tight binding model.
This is not really a flow chart of every calculation that we've done. So what we did is we started simulating a set of carbon nanotubes with DFT methods. We tried to sample all the different scenarios where we have some armchairs. We have an armchair, a zigzag nanotube, a chiral nanotube, and then we fit the interlayer parameters of our intralayer parameters of our tight binding model. And then we simulated different double wall carbon nanotubes, also with different chiralities in the two layers, different interlayer distances, and then extract the interlayer parameters for our model. And then we just use this model to do the transport calculation. And for some of the calculations, we checked again using the DFT approach to see that our model gives the correct results also if we use it in the transport formalism and not just correctly reproduces the band structure of the tubes.
Okay, so the DFT calculations are for both the single wall and double wall nanotubes. Okay, and is that straightforward to get the parameters for the tight binding model from those calculations, or is there some?
I wouldn't say it's like straightforward, like you look at it.
Some interpretation or how to obtain them.
I would not want to interpret the individual parameters of the tight binding model that we set up. We use the third nearest neighbor model in the interlayer interaction. This has already been done for graphene, and it gives accurate results for the band structure, but an interpretation of the individual parameters in the model becomes a little bit tricky because there are repulsive and non-repulsive terms, and some have actually argued that just from a perspective of analyzing the tight binding model, it does not make sense to go to third nearest neighbor because the meaning is basically completely lost. It's just a fitting parameter.
No, I meant more, how do you, is there just one way to obtain the value of the parameter from the DFT calculations? Or
I don't think there is. So what I've done is basically I calculated the band structure with an initial guess for the parameters, and then used an optimization algorithm in order to decrease the differences between the band structure obtained from tight binding and the DFT.
Okay. I see, thanks. Are there any further questions? Okay, I don't think there are. So thank you again, Niels, for this very, very interesting and pedagogical talk.
Thank you for the opportunity to speak here, and to everyone for listening.